Thanks very much, John, for that very kind introduction, kind and thoughtful. Well, I'm delighted to be here, and I'm glad to be talking to you, and I gather I'm talking to you about a topic that has application to the local life. So I hope that at the end of this you'll have a theory of these matters that will help you decide whether John is right. And we could talk about it in discussion too, if you like. Modern epistemology has profited, many philosophers would agree, by expanding beyond Descartes' exclusive focus on the individual knower to encompass the epistemic communities of the sciences. So you might wonder whether you could learn something by thinking of moral knowledge too as the product, not so much of individuals as of communities. Inspired by this thought, I began to explore a number of moral revolutions, greater and lesser, and to see what we might learn from them. One thing I noticed almost immediately was that the struggles to end some very disparate institutions, dueling and foot binding, for example, and I could add slavery, but the case there is so complicated that I've avoided talking about it in these lectures. The struggles to end some very disparate institutions share some surprising features. The first was that arguments against these practices were well known and clearly made long before the movements that finally brought them to an end. Not only were the arguments already there, they were made in terms that we, in other cultures or other times, could recognize and understand. Whatever happened when these admittedly immoral practices ceased then, it wasn't that people were suddenly bowled over by new moral arguments. Dueling was always murderous and irrational and known to be so. Foot binding was always painfully crippling, and there are Chinese proverbs to that effect from the 11th century. This was a surprise about what had not happened. The second, and much more surprising to me anyway, commonality was about what had happened. In each of these transitions, an idea that was naturally called honor played a central role. It was hardly astounding that dueling had to do with honor, nor even that the end of dueling came with new ideas about honor. But it was strange that ideas about national honor figure so largely in accounts of the ending of foot binding. This discovery connected pretty immediately with work that I'd done in the past on the ethics of identity. I'd already explored the ways in which identifications with, say, churches, genders, sexualities, and nations can bind us together in pride and in shame. So I naturally noticed the connection between honor and identity, which I'm going to argue is at the heart of these moral revolutions. But the lesson from the history and philosophy of science is that we learn from detailed attention to the cases. In this lecture and the next, I propose to introduce you to two instructive episodes in the moral history of our species. Here's the first. On the 13th of April, 1829, George IV gave the royal assent to the Catholic Relief Act, which permitted Catholics to sit in Parliament for the first time in over 150 years in Britain. The bill had been shepherded through the legislature by Sir Robert Peel in the Commons and the Duke of Wellington, who had been Prime Minister for a little over a year, in the House of Lords. Both of these statesmen had opposed Catholic emancipation in the past, and they had not changed their minds casually. The Catholic Relief Act eventually passed over the opposition of many members of the Tory majority, among the most vociferous of whom was a man called George William Finch-Hatton, 10th Earl of Winchelsea, who expressed the opinion often, as the bill's final passage drew near, that the Duke of Wellington was plotting an assault on the Protestant constitution. In a broadside in February 1829, Winchelsea had urged his brother Protestants boldly to stand forward in defense of our Protestant constitution and religion. Because, he wrote, the great body of your degenerate senators are prepared to sacrifice at the shrine of treason and rebellion that constitution for which our ancestors so nobly fought and died, he called upon his countrymen to petition king and parliament. He subscribed himself modestly the humble and devoted servant of his Protestant brethren, signing the flyer not so humbly perhaps, Winchelsea and Nottingham, since, as well as being the 10th Earl of Winchelsea, he was the 5th Earl of Nottingham. In a letter to the Standard, published about a week before the bill was finally passed, Winchelsea made a more specific attack upon the Duke of Wellington in particular. He alleged that the King's First Minister had dissembled in offering his financial support for the creation of King's College London as an Anglican institution to counterbalance the recent secular foundation of London University. Thanks very much. The Duke's involvement in this ostentatiously Protestant project, creating an Anglican university to balance the secular university, was a blind, Winchelsea said, to conceal his Roman Catholic sympathies. Now, no one could doubt that Winchelsea felt strongly about the English Church. Charles Gravel, who served as clerk to the Privy Council from 1821 to 1859, who was therefore close to the centre of British government for nearly half a century, described Lord Winchelsea forthrightly as a peer of no personal importance, but a stalwart defender of church and state. Still, here was Winchelsea accusing the hero of the Peninsular War, a man who was widely known as the saviour of Europe, the victor of Waterloo, of dissembling about his true faith and betraying the Constitution. And this was surely, as the gentlemen in the London clubs among whom the accusation circulated might have put it, going a bit far. The Duke had been born in Ireland and had been Chief Secretary for Ireland, the Minister for Ireland as a young politician, and he was particularly well placed to appreciate the delicacy of the situation in that troubled island. Like most Tories, including Peel, who had also once been Chief Secretary for Ireland, he had previously opposed Catholic emancipation. But he had changed his mind because, as he observed in his speech on the second reading of the bill in the House of Lords, a speech that many regarded as one of the best of Wellington's parliamentary career, he had concluded that Ireland was in a state bordering on civil war. That was his phrase. And the King's First Minister added, to cheers in that august chamber, "I must say this, that if I could avoid by any sacrifice whatever even 1 month of civil war in the country to which I am attached, I would sacrifice my life in order to do it." So this change of heart was not a betrayal, it was the thoughtful decision of an experienced statesman. Stung by Winchelsea's published charge against his honour, Wellington insisted that the Earl apologise, which the Earl declined to do. And so on March the 20th, the Duke sent a message requiring Winchelsea to grant him, quote, "that satisfaction which a gentleman has a right to require and which a gentleman never refuses to give." The next morning, the Duke and the Earl met with their seconds on Battersea Fields. The Duke was not an enthusiast for duelling. Indeed, unlike many military officers of the day, and despite one of the most distinguished military careers of his, in fact of any time, he had never duelled before. And as it happens, he never duelled again. He had not encouraged the practice as a commander, though he believed that British honour would be diminished if it was totally suppressed among the officers in his service. In later life, he was a prominent member of the Anti-Duelling Association. Nevertheless, Wellington asked in his note to Winchelsea, quote, "Is the King's Minister to submit to be insulted by any gentleman who thinks proper to attribute to him disgraceful or criminal motives for his conduct as an individual?" And he answered himself immediately, "I cannot doubt of the decision that I ought to make on this question. Your Lordship alone is responsible for the consequences." Well, as Blackstone had written in his commentaries on the law of England of 1765, the common law of England justly fixed the crime and punishment of murder on gentlemen who wanton with their own lives and those of their fellow creatures. So duelling wasn't just illegal, it was murder. Canon law and Christian moral teaching opposed it too. The popes had long ago declared their opposition to the duel. The Council of Trent took the trouble in 1563 at the end of the Reformation to fulminate in the final session of its meetings against, quote, "the detestable custom of duelling introduced by the contrivance of the devil, that by the bloody death of the body he may accomplish the ruin of the soul." Nor was this a topic that divided Catholics from Protestants. As William Wilberforce, no papist he, observed in 1797, the duel's essential guilt consists in this, that it is a deliberate preference of the favour of man before the favour and approbation of God.